He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
There are television moments that live forever, not because they were brilliant, but because they were wrong. Not scripted wrong, not rehearsed wrong, but the kind of wrong that happens when a man forgets where the character ends and where he begins. The kind of wrong that sends a studio audience into stunned silence, that makes a network's phone lines light up before the credits roll, and that causes powerful men in expensive suits to quietly dismantle one of the most beloved shows on American television. This is the story of one of those moments, and for decades, nobody in power wanted you to know it happened. To understand the night everything changed, you have to understand what The Honeymooners was, and what it was not. It was not a polished fantasy. It was not a suburban dream wrapped in a half-hour bow. When it launched as a standalone series on CBS in October of 1955, it was something genuinely unusual on American television, a show about people who were not doing well. Ralph Cramden, played by Jackie Gleason, was a New York City bus driver. He lived with his wife Alice in a sparse Brooklyn apartment, no appliances gleaming on the counter, no manicured lawn visible through a picture window. The refrigerator was nearly empty. The walls were bare. The furniture looked secondhand because it was. In an era when television was almost entirely devoted to selling Americans an idealized image of themselves, The Honeymooners held up a different kind of mirror. It showed the version of America that actually went to work on Monday morning. Gleason had built Ralph Cramden from the inside out, and the raw material was his own life. He was born in Brooklyn in 1916 into a working-class Irish-American family living in Bushwick. His father, Herbert Gleason, abandoned the household when Jackie was 9 years old, simply walked out and never came back. His mother, May, worked whatever jobs she could find to keep the family from complete collapse. She died when Jackie was barely an adult. He had no real education to speak of, no professional training, and no safety net. What he had was an almost supernatural ability to read a room, an instinct for comic timing that felt less like a learned skill and more like a survival mechanism, and a memory full of real people, real desperation, real humor, real rage, that he would spend the rest of his career pouring into his performances. By the time The Honeymooners became a standalone series, Gleason had already been developing the character of Ralph Cramden for several years through sketches on Cavalcade of Stars, his earlier variety program on the Dumont Network. In those early sketches, Ralph was louder, rougher, and less sympathetic than the version audiences would come to love. He was a man perpetually on the edge of something, a bad decision, a broken dream, or a genuinely frightening burst of anger. His famous line, the one he threw at Alice when his temper boiled over. "One of these days, Alice, pow, right in the kisser." Or the variant, "Bang, zoom, straight to the moon," was always meant to walk a very specific line, the line between a man blowing off steam and a man making a genuine threat. The comedy lived in that gap. The audience laughed because they understood it was bluster, because Ralph always backed down, because Alice always won, because beneath all the noise was a man who loved his wife and knew, somewhere in that enormous chest of his, that she was better than him. That understanding, that implicit contract between the show and its audience, was what made The Honeymooners work, and it was what made the night of October 19th, 1956, so profoundly disturbing. The episode was called The Deciding Vote. Its premise was pure honeymooners. Ralph becomes convinced that his single vote in a local civic election will be the one that determines the outcome. The situation balloons from there in the show's characteristic fashion, Ralph's self-importance spiraling outward, Norton getting entangled in the chaos, Alice providing the steady, sardonic counterweight to her husband's grandiosity. On paper, it was a solid episode. The script was tight. The premise was relatable. The live studio audience in the CBS broadcast facility at 221 West 26th Street in Manhattan had every reason to expect a fun evening. For most of the episode, they got one. Gleason was in his element. Live television suited him in a way that the controlled environment of later tape production never quite would. He fed off the energy of a live crowd like it was fuel. He improvised freely. adjusted his timing to the rhythm of their responses, and occasionally caught his co-stars, slightly off guard, with an unexpected reading of a line, which only made everything feel more alive. Art Carney, playing the eternally lovable Ed Norton, was in fine form. Audrey Meadows, who had taken over the role of Alice from Pert Kelton several years earlier, was doing what she always did, anchoring every scene with a quiet, grounded presence that made Gleason's performance possible. She once described her job as being the still point around which the hurricane moved. That night, the hurricane moved differently. Late in the episode, during a confrontation between Ralph and Alice, Gleason delivered the line, the same line the audience had heard in various forms dozens of times before. Bang, zoom, straight to the moon, Alice. But something had changed. The words were the same. The delivery was not. Gleason's voice dropped out of its usual comedic register, the booming, performative bluster that signaled to audiences this was theater, this was safe, this was Ralph being Ralph. What replaced it was something quieter, more controlled, the kind of angry quiet that is genuinely more alarming than shouting. He stepped closer to Meadows. Not a theatrical step, a real one. The studio went from warm laughter to complete silence in the space of about 2 seconds. Not the polite, expectant silence of an audience waiting for the next joke. The other kind of silence. The kind where everyone in the room realizes simultaneously that something has shifted.
Crew members who were present that evening later described a sensation backstage of the floor becoming unsteady. One stage manager reportedly stopped in the middle of what he was doing and simply stared at the monitor. The audience in the studio, people who had come to laugh, who had been laughing right up until that moment, sat motionless. Meadows herself, by all accounts a consummate professional who was not easily rattled, held completely still. Whether that was acting or something else entirely is a question that was never fully answered. The moment passed. Gleason recovered, the scene moved forward, the episode ended. But the phone lines at CBS were active before the broadcast concluded. The letters followed within days. Some were from viewers expressing confusion. Others were from viewers expressing something closer to alarm. Critics who had championed the show for its honesty, who had praised it specifically for depicting a marriage that looked and sounded like real life, now found themselves confronting what happened when real life stopped being safely comic. Several wrote that the scene had felt, in their words, uncomfortably true. That was not a compliment. Inside CBS, the atmosphere was already under strain. Advertising in the 1950s was not a passive arrangement. Sponsors did not simply purchase airtime and look away. They paid attention. They had opinions about tone, about content, about whether a program was the right environment for their products. Several of the sponsors associated with the Honeymooners had already raised concerns in the weeks and months prior to that October broadcast. The show's humor was described in internal communications as too rough, too unpredictable. There were conversations about whether Gleason himself was becoming a liability. His well-documented late nights, his heavy drinking, his refusal to follow conventional production schedules were the kind of variables that made network executives deeply uneasy. A live half-hour comedy broadcast to 60 million American homes every week with a star who operated outside the normal rules of the industry was always going to be a risk. After October 19th, that risk looked different. What followed was handled the way CBS tended to handle uncomfortable situations in that era, quietly and without public explanation. There was no announcement that The Honeymooners was being canceled. No farewell episode. No statement from the network, from Gleason, or from any member of the cast. The show simply stopped. One week it was on. The next week it was not. For viewers who had made it part of their weekly routine, the disappearance was jarring and confusing. For those inside the production, it was the end of something that had never quite been matched before and would never quite be matched again. Gleason did not take it quietly, even if he took it privately. He had always understood the commercial realities of the industry, but Ralph Cramden was not a job to him in the way that other roles had been. The character was constructed from too much of his own interior life, the Brooklyn poverty, the absent father, the dreams that outran the means to achieve them, the particular frustration of a man who believed he deserved more than the world was prepared to give him. Losing the show was not simply a professional setback. It registered as something more personal than that. In the years that followed, friends and colleagues noted that Gleason spoke about the cancellation infrequently and without the detached equanimity he brought to most topics. It had stung him somewhere that didn't heal easily. He was resourceful enough to protect what he could. In a move that was unusual for the period and that reflected both his business acumen and his emotional investment in the property, Gleason negotiated to buy back the rights to the Honeymooners from CBS. The network, having already decided the show was a problem they were done managing, agreed. Gleason held those rights for the rest of his life, bringing Ralph and Alice back periodically in sketches on his subsequent variety programs. The chemistry was real. The laughs still came. But the specific electricity of those original 39 episodes, the combination of live performance, genuine financial constraint in the production, and the raw urgency of a show that hadn't yet learned to protect itself, could not be reconstructed. Something about the controlled environment of later productions, the ability to stop and reset, to edit and revise, drained the particular tension that had made the original run so compelling. Audrey Meadows moved on in ways that surprised people who assumed actresses from 1950s sitcoms followed a narrow path. She largely stepped back from television work and turned her attention to business, eventually becoming one of the first women to serve on the board of directors of a major American financial institution. The wit and precision she had brought to Alice Cramden were not, it turned out, purely comedic attributes. Art Carney, whose Norton had been as essential to the show's texture as either of the leads, found success in film that extended well beyond what most expected, ultimately winning an Academy Award in 1974 for his performance in Harry and Tonto. The Honeymooners itself followed a trajectory that nobody could have predicted from the circumstances of its ending. The 39 original episodes entered syndication and began appearing on local stations in daytime and late-night slots through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Freed from the pressure of weekly ratings and the anxious scrutiny of advertisers, the show found new audiences and began to acquire the reputation it had not been allowed to establish during its first run. By the 1970s, what had once been considered too raw, too real, too uncomfortable for primetime American television was being taught in film and television programs as a foundational text, one of the documents that established what character-driven comedy could do when it chose honesty over comfort.
The bang zoom line, once at the center of an uncomfortable national conversation about what television was permitted to show and what the line between humor and menace actually was, became over time something closer to a cultural artifact. It was quoted, parroted, referenced in cartoons and political speeches and advertising. The menace drained out of it, replaced by nostalgia. Whether that transformation represented a genuine critical reassessment or simply the long erosion of context is a question worth sitting with. What is not in question is what that line represented at the moment. It was delivered differently than it had ever been delivered before, in a live broadcast to 60 million people on an autumn evening in 1956. It represented the point at which a television show that had been telling a particular kind of truth for 2 years told one more truth that the industry was not prepared to absorb. Not a manufactured truth, carefully scripted and safely contained within the conventions of comedy. Something less controlled than that. Something that came from wherever Jackie Gleason actually lived. Not on the stage, not in the character, but in the place underneath both, where Brooklyn never really left, and where the loss of a father and the weight of decades of struggle had settled in ways that could not always be fully managed. Television has never entirely known what to do with that place. It prefers its edges smooth, its dangers theoretical, its moments of apparent menace clearly labeled as performance. The night those labels slipped, for just a few seconds, in a small CBS studio in Manhattan, was the night the Honeymooners ended. What it left behind was the argument, still unresolved, still worth having, about what we actually want from the performers we invite into our living rooms every week, and how much of the real thing we are genuinely prepared to receive.